Good evening, my brothers and sisters, and thank you so much for sharing with us in this next installment of Let's Talk. You know, there's so many things to talk about, so many things that are going on in our community, in our country, in our world, in our lives. And there's so many moments when all of us are wondering, what do we do and how do we face it? Well, one thing we should be doing is having conversations. There's something about sharing with others. The Bible talks about in the council or in the council of many, there is wisdom. And we can gain so much from just having a conversation. In fact, conversations help us to correct some misunderstandings, help us develop new friendships, and help us develop respect for both people and for ideas. So, our series of Let's Talk is geared to have us connect with one another and start conversations. Start talking about some of the critical, crucial areas in our world and in our lives. Talking about relationships, talking about fitness in our body and health, talking about finance. So many different topics. And tonight, we add to it talking about justice. What is justice? And how do we come to the conversation of justice? And when you talk about justice, you have to talk about its converse, injustice. Many of us have our own horror stories. Many of us have our own testimonies of what we've come through and how we got over. Tonight, I'm joined and flanked by friends, persons whose ideas and thoughts I tremendously respect, and I ask them to join with me in a conversation in this time when we're dealing with war in Ukraine, dealing with the international conflicts, dealing with the struggles all over our country, mass murders, dealing with children that are quote unquote left behind when no child is supposed to be left behind, dealing with abuse and abusive situations, dealing with an insurrection, dealing with trials and courtrooms and indictments, dealing with food deserts and credit deserts. I've asked them to talk with me and we can share a conversation about faith and justice because these are people of faith. These are men and women of faith, and I've asked them to join me tonight that we might have a conversation from a faith posture about what justice is, why we're involved in it, and what God is saying to us, to people of faith, about the injustices in the world. So let me start by just letting everyone introduce themselves. Ed?
I'm Eddie Kane. I have been a member of New Psalmists for about 45 years, I guess, something like that, which is a significant portion of my life. And I'll leave it at that for a moment.
Okay. Tammy?
Good evening. I'm Tammy Turner. I've been a member of New Psalmists for over 20 years. I'm a practicing attorney. I've served as a general counsel for 3 school systems. I'm a mom and a faithful member of New Psalmists.
Yeah, I'm Pete France, Wendell France. I've served here as a member of the ministerial team. I chair the social action SALT team for the church, and I've been here for about 13 to 14 years.
Ojeda Hall, France. I help to lead our local missions ministry, and I am president of the One Love Foundation that works to end relationship abuse.
So we've got persons from different walks of life. You see justice and injustice. Truthfully, all of you see it every day. You have to deal with it. You have to confront it. You have to kind of find arguments to address it and then find techniques to try to redress it. But let me ask you a question, a starting question, because sometimes people say folk of faith don't really get involved in the real issues of life. All we do is sing and shout, wave our hand, fall out on the floor, and wait for somebody to come by with smelling sauce and drag us to a pew. But what brought you to the issue of justice? And maybe what even is justice for you? JD, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think my mother used to say, to whom much is given, much is required. And I think she said that because it became clear I was maybe the first in my mother's family to go to college. My grandmother had been valedictorian of our high school from North Carolina, couldn't go to college. My mother ended up going to college much later. My dad didn't go. And I became very aware that education is a privilege, that my parents were very much invested in my education. And all these incredibly intelligent women, my mother's the oldest of 4 girls, hadn't had a chance to go. And so that formed me, that these powerful women who are leaders in their community, for reasons of economic injustice, for relationship abuse issues, that they weren't able to have sort of the access to education that I had.
So, in some ways, justice for you deals with the question of, or has in it, what we haven't had a chance to participate in. Eddie, how about you?
So I did not mention earlier that I'm also an attorney, though not currently actively in law practice. I have worked in private practice, have been general counsel in-house as well as in government, and spent most of my working life doing some form of real estate or housing law work, generally transactional. I think the interesting thing is that the journey to becoming a lawyer, which I'm not ashamed to admit was originally inspired by Perry Mason reruns when I was little. Which,
Many of us saw him.
absolutely. It's interesting because I think my approach to justice, which probably surfaces in my career arc, where now I work for a philanthropic investment organization that is all about advancing better outcomes for young people in the greater Washington region. I spent a lot of my career in affordable housing. And I think that my approach to and sort of journey to justice was much more about people and the exercise of the faith, right? I think one of the things that, having hung around here for, since it wasn't here, right? The fact that people are important, that love is central and the central assignment. That's something I think I've always wrestled with on some level, right? I had the same, at home, to whom much is given, and high expectation, like you did growing up. And I think that and sort of the personal development, the education, always had to kind of contend with the requirement that you have to work both sides of the street, right? That's a sermon for people who've been around a while, right? It was, you gotta work both sides of the street. You eventually have to go back to Egypt and bring out the rest of the tribe, right? Those were the faith exercises that, as a young person and then as a young man and now as an older young man, were a part of the development here. And I think they have played themselves out in how I engage with my community and in the work that I found myself in, even as I was training and aspiring to things that were more strictly business, more remunerative, more about the same thing that other young professionals do. I think I always had this sort of call and obligation to be about something that advances love centrally.
I remember, Eddie, it must have been now about 30 years ago, or right after law school, and you were working for a big law firm, and we were having lunch. And your emphasis then was what it is now. I must make a difference for somebody else. Now think about it. For justice for you, Jada, is a chance that has been denied others. For you, Eddie, justice is a responsibility that you have to help others to go back. Tammy, how about you?
Mine is very much about the obligation to help others. I grew up in Baltimore City, and I remember as a very young kid seeing injustices. And it never set right with my spirit. It just didn't. And it was compounded by growing up in church and hearing the least of these. And so my question became, what do I do to make sure that when my family goes on a vacation, even as a 6, 7-year-old child, we're not the only Black people. Because I know Black people deserve vacations. I know kids deserve to be in pools and to travel. And I grew up in a community where folks were about their education, they were committed to family and hope, but we were all there. And so I wanted to make sure in my life that however I could chip away whatever barriers there were for people who were unseen by others in power, that I did so.
You know, it's interesting you say that because I grew up in the streets of Baltimore too, in Cherry Hill. And I grew up liking my life, but always aware that if there was a shock to it, somebody get killed or something happen, there would be no redress to it. There would be no better. We would just pick up and keep on going. And somehow that just never settled right in my spirit. Just like you see these things and you say, something is wrong here. Something is wrong with this picture. Pete?
Yeah, I grew up in West Baltimore, and we saw, we're pretty close-knit community, even though you're larger communities, pretty much close-knit communities. And so I didn't have a real context of justice versus injustice, actually, until I became a police officer.
Talk about it.
And it was not what I saw on the street that raised the issue of injustice for me. It was how we were treated in the organization. And that began the path for me, the journey that I took to begin advocating for, first, for equity in policing for African Americans and women, and then branching out more, to deal with the injustices that the community experienced. But my primary focus in the earlier days, confronting injustice, had to deal with the management, administration, and the execution of policies related to how African Americans were treated in policing.
When you think about this, and you think about, as Eddie said, he'd been hanging around here a long time. Can you imagine a world where people of faith do not see this as the active side of faith? Or do you say to yourself, nah, even if I want to be still, I got to be proactive? You know, there are people who are listening and sharing with us tonight who I really want to sense the fact that this is not just a heady conversation, just something we talk about this is something we really live. One of the things that I've become very cognizant about is that everybody hasn't lived in our world. They haven't lived through what we've lived through. And many of us realize, because of what we've been through, in the words of the old song, there must be a God somewhere. Some folk come to faith because of what they go through. And some folk go to justice because of their faith. Tammy, you kick in with us. Talk about that.
I believe I went to justice because of my faith. I'm a believer that we all have gifts and talents, and the question becomes, how do you use them and for what purpose do you use them? And for me, it doesn't have to be anything huge or life-altering. I say again, you can chip away at it from wherever you lead, whether you be in the police department, whether you be a lawyer, whether you be a minister, or a president of a nonprofit. We all have a role to play. We often say in our community, and probably in others, something needs to be done. Somebody needs to do something. And I think we're all that somebody. And so to the extent that you can make any small effort, whether it be mentoring kids, being in the PTA, volunteering.
Because you're in the school system. And many parents talk about the injustice in the system. what would you say to a parent that wants to gripe?
I would say run for a school board seat.
No, no, seriously, go ahead right here. Yeah, that's
I
what I'm
would say
saying.
run for a school board seat. Um, I assure parents to the extent that I can that when they come to school board meetings to speak, they are heard and their concerns become an issue that the administration will try to address. But if you really want to change things, run for a school board seat. We have a new governor. Apply for some of those commissions. There are commissions in so many avenues that people don't think they're qualified for. They are. Just try.
You know, Ed, you want to pick up that one?
Yeah. So two things resonated with me. One is the the engagement and action that you're talking about, and the other was your question. They're related. The other was your question. Can you imagine a world where people don't react to some of the things they see with the same things? Listen, I think it the results of what's going on in our world would suggest there are a lot of people who hear, I will say, some version of the same gospel we listen to, and they're not stirred the same way, right? It doesn't create a lens for them that makes them care about the results and each other's results in a way that they would move, right? And so there might be the gripe, but there's not the inclination to do something about it, big or small, official or private, right? And so, it's interesting hearing Tammy talk about it because, there are those of us, I've met people who've been inspired by people who are very activist in their approach to these issues, right? They make it a life's call. And then there are other people who just try to, do right by their neighbor, who are moved by the fact that I see a condition that doesn't look right and it bothers me, right? And move through the world like that. And I think that we seem to be, I don't know, de-incentivizing that sort of compassion for each other. It's not easy, right? I mean, the self-sacrifice on behalf of somebody, particularly somebody not your tribe, not your party, not your group, is way out of fashion right now, right? And so, I listen to, you hear a lot about school boards these days and people running for them who have agendas that I would not call especially compassionate. And the idea that, that same sort of takeover would be on behalf of people who are just trying to make things better for each other, right? Not because I should not have to explain that to my kid that there's a part of the world that doesn't look like her that they need to figure out how to navigate and accept, right? That's the agenda is just our assignment. What's required of us is that we be a part of making stuff better, right? And what you said resonated with me. I don't know that I have the response to that, but it resonated with me because you're encouraging people to engage to do that. And I think we are, there's a lot going on around us that's pushing back against that these days.
It is, and you pick up a great word. Both of you said it, and all three. Everybody said that word caring. Under the hospital tuck of the sheet is that word caring. That somehow something inside of you cares enough to be involved and try to make a difference, cares enough to speak. I'm really not a great fond lover of the phrase "speak your truth" as if it's somebody else, but speak the truth in love, to speak the truth, but that whole sense of caring. Jada, when you think of justice and your life commitment to it, think about that word, because you're a person of faith, you're a minister also, you and Pete both, but think about that, how that word caring grabs your commitment.
Oh my gosh. I remember in maybe 2005, I was in Brooklyn, New York. I was working on issues of economic justice, working with low-income women to start their own businesses, to learn how to save and build money. And I met an organization that was making change, Bishop. I mean, a group of churches, East Brooklyn congregations, and they were fixing streets and starting schools and calling officers to account. And I thought to myself, what is the training that undergirds that kind of courage and that kind of movement building? And I went to a training that President Barack Obama has gone through, Hillary Clinton. I went to this industrial areas community organizing training, and they talked about three things: justice, leadership, and power. And they talked about it in ways that I had some awareness that I had some power, and certainly I had a degree that indicated I had power. But had anyone really talked to me about the power that is in me through the grief and even the anger that is in me? And that was the first time I learned that anger, rage may be a bad word, but anger is actually not a bad word. Anger over things that should be but aren't.
In
Anger,
fact, the Bible says, "Be angry
and sin
and
not.
sin not."
Right. And so the sense that whatever God is stirring up on the inside should be listened to, trained, developed. Leaders are trained and developed, not necessarily natural born, but that you can train someone to understand strategy, power. Power flows through relationships, the way the civic and the political and the government, civic and corporate sectors work together. And in your teaching, the belief inside of me that God has given us authority, to trample on snakes. So for me, it's my belief that people in New Psalmist can run for office, that people in New Psalmist can organize their neighborhoods, their communities, that people in New Psalmist can be advocates. I believe that, and just grateful to be able to work on that here.
Me too, I believe. Pete, you want to jump in?
Well, I just think it's important to remember that it's not typical, that thing that wells up in your spirit that causes you to act. It's not something that everyone has, and those who have it sometimes need to be patient with those who don't have it, because we can become very quick and short-tempered when we feel that there's something that needs to be addressed and nobody else sees it but us. What I think we should do is just go ahead and do what we're supposed to do, what we're called to do, and then others will join us. I'm reminded, my parents took us to church. They introduced us to church. But it was my grandfather who, for me, caused me to make the connection between church, faith, and justice. And it was because of how he lived his life, or how he represented himself to me. He was a grocery store owner in Catonsville. He was a member of Grace AME Church on Winners Lane. And he consistently, and he was a long-term member there, and as a store owner, he consistently was engaged in doing stuff for people. So he was organizing, getting people in Catonsville rides to Spring Grove and the hospitals when people didn't have cars. He was engaged in making sure if you didn't have enough money for groceries, that you could put it on the books. He was engaged in making sure somebody along Winners Lane had a place to live. And so he and his brothers represented, not that my parents didn't show me that, but I saw that whole faith commitment, that seeking out justice, trying to make the crooked places straight for people. I saw that in my grandfather. I'm often reminded when Paul tells Timothy, I saw it in your mother and your grandmother, so it's got to be in you. Go do what you're supposed to do. That scripture just stays in my mind because my grandfather, he had that in him. And I just think that, for me, that's where this notion about working and helping people reach certain places where they need to be, even at risk, sometimes at risk. Sometimes you make decisions to try to help people, and it doesn't go as you plan, but you still have to hold on to your faith and the belief that you're working towards something that will serve someone else or help someone else.
You know, the Bible says, Micah says, what does the Lord require of you? To do justly, love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. That justice is the action side of our relationship with God. We talk about justice and righteousness. Well, righteousness is the heavenly axis. Justice is the earthly axis. My right relationship with God is only right if my justice, if I am treating people justly. Let me go back to my growing up. I grew up where we rode to Virginia to see my grandparents, and my mama had all the food in the car. We never stopped, and that was normal. That was normal. I grew up where we walked to our little school in the neighborhood, and we did not go out much past that. That was normal. I grew up where we rode up Edmondson Avenue. We rode up Edmondson Avenue. You know where Hilton?
Edmondson Village Shopping Center.
Edmondson Village Shopping Center, and we sat in the car looking out the window at the houses with our mouths open, knowing we could not stop that car and we could not get out on that street. That was not going to work, but it was pristine. It was perfect. I grew up going to junior high school, taking a bus, 2 hours at least. I'd catch the 7 o'clock bus out of Cherry Hill at age 12 to go to Garrison Junior High School up on Barrington Road. At age 12, I don't think you'd put a child on the bus at age 12 on the transit company bus. And I remember running down the hall with my book bag because the bus was late and watching the teacher take the handle of the door. And as I ran, along with the person running beside me, he shut the door. And when we got right to the door, he pulled it all the way to, which meant we had to go to detention. And we'd miss our bus going back home. So by the time I got home that night, it's pitch black. It wasn't until I went to college that I actually saw you could make change. I know that sounds so strange because everything was normative. Martin King had marched on Washington, but we still couldn't get a loan to buy the house that Daddy wanted to buy in Catonsville. Nothing had really changed. They were still fighting over busing. And whether it changed or not, you heard the tone on the television of how people thought about you and what they thought of you. You heard George Wallace running for president. I remember Spiro Agnew laying out the folk from Baltimore during the riots. You heard all that. And I'm wondering now if folk think injustice is the norm. And that, see, in our day, going to college helped me understand there were folk who were fighting. I hadn't read Daniel Walker's Appeal or Franz Fanon or Amir Baraka. I hadn't read them in high school. It was in the dormitory that we read this and we had these conversations. Do you think that there is a normalization of injustice? And if so, can you talk about it in a way that we can spur conversations from those that are
let me
listening?
just, it's funny you say a normalization of injustice. We constantly see people in our communities complain about how they are disenfranchised by policing, the inequities that exist within the criminal justice system, how we are targeted and so forth. And so to a certain extent, maybe people believe that that's the system that we should accept. But I don't think so.
Okay.
I think that to normalize this, what we find as being reprehensible about the criminal justice system is in fact doing ourselves a disservice. And so ought we not think of other ways that we can manage ourselves that require us not to use or rely on or have to contact police in the first place? So I've just been a strong advocate for community control of policing, but not in the sense that you hear talked about by politicians. I mean some form of policing or some form of community control where policing is the last resort. What does that mean? That means that we have to have faith and belief in each other that we can resolve conflict or deal with other interpersonal problems or have access to good mental health programs, have access to good educational opportunities in our school system. So to extract policing from our community as I believe we should, we have to then step up as parents, as grandparents, as neighbors to ensure that we provide those things that are lacking, that cause us to call the police. If policing were a private company, they'd be out of business because we have to be satisfied with the service, or you find someone else and that business goes out of business, some other service replaces. So in our society, if policing were a private industry, they would be out of business because we're not satisfied with the product.
That might be the sound bite of the night, Pete.
Well, we're not satisfied with the product. And it's not like just Baltimore, it's policing or the form of policing we use in this country. How we adopted it, where it came from, how officers are socialized. I mean, there's just a whole platform of issues that interject itself into policing and into our communities that take away our faith, take away our hope, and take away what we think justice should look like. When we see things happening different in other communities.
I got you. Jada, you jump in here.
You make me think about what we saw recently with the protest. 26 million young people are out protesting George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And some of us older folks are like, we're not going out in the street to protest anymore. That day has passed. Oh, but those young people showed us that day has not passed.
Yes.
And have launched a movement around diversity, equity, and inclusion that is through corporate America and other places where people have to contend with what are going to be their social contributions. And sometimes we can look down on our young people. And I love that New Psalmist has a thriving and is committed to the growth and development of our millennials and our young adults, because they are showing us that we can normalize something else too. Again, we can normalize activism and change. And you were preaching on Sunday, and it made me think about God as change. And that all of us, if we embrace God as change, what is the change God is calling us to make and how to move? So I thought about the normalization of injustice, but like the potential renormalization of activism.
You know, that's a good pickup. The renormalization of activism. You know, that it becomes, and for people of faith, it is not a choice. It is the nature of who we are. We don't always articulate it correctly, and we don't always manifest it correctly, but it is a part of who we are. And we can't be ashamed to say that. We can't be ashamed to declare it. When I'm looking at what's happening in our nation, in our country, in our world, and seeing how close we are to a return of days we thought we'd never see again. And for some, days they've never seen. You know, when we hear the disavowal of programs that talk about our history, that's a knife. That almost feels like a a hot knife through butter. You know, you're saying that my experience has not added value, and yet over away with tears has been watered, treading the path through the blood of the slaughter. When we think of all of those who've died, so people of faith cannot sit on the sidelines, though everyone's not a running back and a quarterback.
Right.
Everybody's not a deep pass wide receiver, but everybody has to be suited up. It has to be suited up. If you were talking to a group of your friends who were kind of slightly dismissive of all of this involvement, because some of our people get a little comfortable in rarefied air and think that Gil Scott Heron's words will not meet them. The revolution will not be televised. They will come after you too. And so they dismiss and think that this is. How would you speak to them so that they would know what's driving you? What's driving you is not our maleness, not our blackness, not our ageness, not our culture, our class. What's driving us is our connection to the God who cares. Tammy, Ed, you all jump in over here. How would you talk to them?
I would start by asking for their definition of Christianity. Because does it not require that we live and act with compassion and empathy? Are we not our brother's keepers? And how are you exercising that in the smallest of ways? Yes, I mentioned being a school board member, but you can mentor a kid. You can work on housing issues. You can start a garden to feed folks that don't have food and that live in food deserts. So I don't think there's an expectation, as you said, that everybody is at the forefront, but we have an obligation while we occupy this earth, in my opinion, to be of service to people and to make the world better in some small way. Incrementally, I think we are at a place where, as Ojeda said, I am extraordinarily happy and proud of millennials who seem to be taking the helm. I don't think that means that folks in my generation are not as involved. Some are tired. So take a break. I give you 24 hours, as Bishop would say, to cry.
24 hours to chill out, but afterward,
get back out there.
Eddie?
I think I would urge, folks to listen, right? It was interesting hearing you talk about the reignition of activism and that sort of thing. And I think the fight is that if injustice isn't normalized, certainly there is a fight to redefine what we consider to be unjust as just, right? The whole, you can be in a fight, and if the rules of the fight change in the middle of it, you will find yourself at a distinct disadvantage. And I think that part of our, discernment and watchfulness, right, has to be about fighting about the terms of the fight, right? Fighting about the rules of engagement in addition to being out on the street and pushing the point, not allowing the space to be reclaimed in a way that, the slights and the indignities that no matter how much insulation you have from, discrimination or racism or any other ill effect of society, I participated in an experiment in a training one day where you had folks rate the extent to which they thought that being black resulted in the difficulties that they faced, and it was a mixed group, and it's called a color line, and then they had folks line up according to their score, and you were ranking from 0 to 3, and literally it looked like a paint palette when you looked across the room, where not only was it black people on one end of the line all the way to a white person on the other end of the line, it was actually complexion right, and shades of, and how darkly complected people were, was also reflected in the same line in terms of what people thought the impact of race was on their daily lives. And I think that the thing that is crazy, of course, that surprised some of our white counterparts who thought, well, you are educated and well paid and influential, and I like you. I don't. What's the? I have it. I find it difficult to believe that that's how you view your life. And I think more broadly, much of what went into those scores, right, for people who were talking about how much they felt the impact, is things that have been redefined as no longer actionable, right, or important, right? You are expected now that you will live with a certain amount of indignity and slight, and that's just your lot for being a part of this, right? And the maybe that fight's still going on, but it feels like it's an uphill slog these days to wrestle that back to some place that feels more neutral.
And especially when you think it might be over. I mean, I've been in places, in a restaurant, where the man gave me the keys to his car, to park his car. That took me one place, Here, y'all, boy, park my car. I'm probably older than him. You see these things, and you say, I thought it was past this, and it's coming back. It's creeping back. It's coming back around. But the reality of it is, these terms and these actions, if we don't address them, if we don't step to them, something worse is going to happen. When you mentioned, I remember when we talked equality, when the big aim was equality. But then we realized that equality didn't mean equality. Give me the same opportunity you give Pete. Yes, give us both the same opportunity to apply to this college. But Pete comes with, a a high school degree from a boarding school in Massachusetts where they had tutors and everything else. I come from the hood where we didn't have internet. Yeah, we both got equal opportunity to apply, but the playing field ain't the same. So then we came up with words like equity. And those words now are being tomahawked, hatcheted. The point you made, the rules are changing midway. And people of faith sometimes have a tendency to do one of two things: miss the change. No, one of three. Miss the change, be unable to make the pivot, or three, quit. How do we tell both the older and the younger folk? Because as you mentioned, Jada, the younger ones are out there marching and whatever, but they got to pivot too sometimes because the rules change. I mean, these last couple of years, we've been watching unbelievable rule changes. And Congress has been trying to change rules. I mean, we've been talking about implications of things, but Congress is straight up trying to rewrite rules. The Supreme Court is rewriting rules. School boards are rewriting rules. City councils are rewriting rules. State legislatures are rewriting rules. And we have to change the way we play the game. But we are people of faith. We're people of faith. The thing that encourages me the most in my effort in any struggle is to know that the power that was at work in Jesus is at work in me. But now that does not mean, but think about it. In this day and age, you will suffer. You will suffer. George Floyd was not the only person who died. He is one of a long list, and he died from police. But there are folk who just shoot you in the street. Police aren't the only people who perpetrate injustice, among the people of the community or whatever. And there are good police and bad police, but there are people in the citizenry who've taken up arms, going into markets and stores and blowing folk away. I need you to speak to people of faith about the even though it's tough, we can't quit.
Well,
Pete?
that has to be the mantra. We don't have any, we don't have the right to quit. I mean, we really have an obligation to see as much through as possible, as long as we have the ability. I think a lot, and maybe I'm maybe a little different. I think a lot about Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction era that we went through, and I think, and we don't even talk about Reconstruction in our modern context of the African American experience in this country.
We talk about the end.
We talk about the end. We get to right to the civil rights movement, which came much later than. But what happened during Reconstruction is foundational to where we are now. People saw a black president and determined that that's never going to happen again. And no matter what we have to do to right size or wrong size this country, that's not going to happen. And we have to stay committed and focused that whether we never get another black president, we have to make sure that the entire cart isn't overturned. And that's the desire, to just turn over the entire cart and go back to pre-Reconstruction, you know, before we had rights. And so many of our African American leaders, particularly, just don't seem to be conscious about where we are being taken to, because it may in fact not align with what their agenda is. And so that's why you got to have the faith. You got to just look past those folks and know that you know, you got to stay in the fight. You got to stay in the struggle.
That whole sense of Reconstruction, that we lost a lot. And, you know, all of those things that were put in place, we lost. And we don't realize that the effort is being put afoot to end this era. One of the things that I find extremely interesting is the whole conversation when we talk about systemic issues, like systemic racism or systemic culturalism. And you'll hear people talking about the system isn't there. No, the system is what the system is. But when we talk, for me, when I talk about systemic issues and systemic racism or systemic culturalism, what I'm saying is not that the system has just passed laws to make it happen, but the system affords the opportunity for folk to exercise authority over folk through their ideas and their practices. Yes. No, they don't have to pass a law. They just make it impossible for me to be able to get medical treatment or to get, to be able to vote. No, they just look at me and say, no, I don't want you on the job. The system does not just pass a law, but the system creates an opportunity for all of the isms to feel free to exist and exercise whatever they is that they want to exercise on people. And I think we are not really clear that somebody has a different aim and agenda. And if there's any army that's got to rise up, not with AK-47s, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but we've got to rise up with what Martin King said, the message. Martin King had the message that spoke to America. Did he change all of America? No. But he made all of America aware of the conversation. And he made, quote unquote, political correctness something folk had to address. You cannot still call me boy. You cannot get away just calling my mama girl. We will stand up. It's the great line from The Elephant Man. I am a man. I am a man. People of faith, you know, I think we hear political sermons, but talk to me about the message that resonates with you that makes you fight injustice. What is the gospel you hear that makes you stand against injustice and know that you can? Who wants to jump in first?
I can
Okay,
think of
Jay.
So I can think of a couple. I mean, going back to the Old Testament, this idea that Abraham is blessed to be a blessing, right? And I love this idea that God creates his own clan to be special in all the earth, to do, to do extraordinary things. And he's got our back, and we can be this tiny band of people, right, coming out of Egypt, this tiny band of people that transforms a world that is very mature by the time they get in it. And God drives people out before them and changes their circumstances. That's us. And we need to tell our kids that those Genesis stories in modern day ways that will convince our kids God has our back. We are his people and God has our back. Go ye therefore, go make that change. So that's one of them. I think the other one where Jesus talks about, in him there's neither Jew nor Greek nor male nor female. No, I mean, this idea of no partiality. And our kids and we obviously have experienced partiality and bias. I mean, everybody's talking about implicit bias and microaggressions. I mean, we know this stuff. Racism used to be overt, right? Other generations were in your face. Now, I'm exhausted by the time I finish work because of the implicit bias and the attacks wielded against me because people are like, who does she think she is, this black woman? Whatever. So, I mean, continuing to help our young people understand how to bring about impartiality, that Jesus is about fairness and there are biases, but that Jesus wants us to have
when you say that, I think of moments when I've had that attack come at me. I felt strong before the fight, coming down the aisle, getting in the ring. But once that person, I remember we were trying to do some work at the church and we had to deal with a banker. And the banker looked at me. I mean, I knew what I brought to the table. And I had the rest of the team. The banker looked at me and said, why should we be listening to you? You're just a little preacher. At that moment, I mean, I knew what I brought to the table, but at that moment, I felt the entire, I don't know how to say this correctly, I was fighting against not just him, but the entire system. That's the issue I think nobody ever talks about. Once you get in the ring and the first blow is hit, you realize you didn't just get the blow from that person. You got that blow from a society that has nurtured that person to fight. Tell me how that faith then keeps you in the fight. I mean, I remember what I said. I have not forgotten what I said. But everybody's not going to be there. Eddie, go ahead.
I'm laughing because I haven't forgotten what you said either because I've heard the story. But I was running through my verses, for the moment, and for that, Lord's my light and my salvation, and also this is my command that you love one another, love your neighbor as yourself, and so all of those things I think are things that are a part of this, the fabric, the bedrock that I stand on as a person, right? And for much of at least the adult part of my walk, particularly here, the question that you've been telling us to ask ourselves is, who am I? Right? Who am I and where am I going in that order? Right? That was discipleship class the first day, right? Who am I and where am I going? And I think so when you combine that with the not optional, not conditioned command to love each other, the not optional, not conditioned command to do justly, right? And you recognize that that's who you are, the struggle becomes, how do you move through the world that you're describing in that posture, right? Because what you are talking about would cause you to walk into those situations loaded for bear, right? And walk into every situation where you're confronting systems, people, all of this in ways that are loaded for bear, with a message that says somebody who is postured the way you are is weak. And I think the one thing that I really, that I really thought about in advance of this conversation was that the strength that it takes to be able to come into these situations and address them from a position of love and compassion is significantly underestimated, right? That's why we're tired, right? That's why you're exhausted, Jada, right? That's why you feel beat up, because you are coming with all this obligation that says that the first couple words of your response could not have been unprintable, right? That's because the next story of it, yeah, you know what Pastor said in the office the other day, right? Right? We could not go in there, and I think that people think of it as passive, right? And if you are not chasing what we're all chasing, your personal empowerment, your personal enrichment, and exercising it in a way that aggressively steps on the head of somebody else to get up because it's zero sum and you got to get yours or there won't be any. Operating justly in a situation that's defined like that, I think takes a strength that people just don't fathom. And I think that if this conversation is about how we are talking to people who are coming into it or asking questions about it, it is that the strength and the power that you talked about earlier, and that that putting it together compassion like your grandfather, or the activism, whatever all this stuff we talked about, you've got to tap into something that is strong enough that it fuels something that looks passive, right? You look like you are there to take everybody else's stuff. And the strength to be able to do that and not wipe everybody else out is fairly significant. And I don't think we talk about that enough.
But all of you need to, it's almost like somebody just put parachutes on our back and we just jumped out of a plane, because none of you have quit. Listen, take what Eddie said. You found that strength that you didn't even know you were tapping into sometimes. You found and you've operated from that posture, not always cognizant that you were, because it became so ingrained in you. But after that, like the song says, after all the things you've been through, you're still in the fight. You're still in the fight. Now, somebody may say, well, that's not the fight I'm in. But no, every one of us has our own.
Yes.
And you may say, you're not in mine, but I just want to ask you, are you in yours? And what are the weapons of your warfare? What is it that because you're right, Eddie, it takes Jesus modeled the battle against injustice. He fought an unjust system. He fought an unjust society. He fought a church or a religious community that was inequitable in its dealing. And he fought it all with the thing you said, this undeniable and indomitable, indefatigable faith and connection to God that made him love his enemies. As Camus would say, until the rebel is no longer the rebel, until the slave is no longer the slave. Made him, and he did it authentically. What would you say? Talk to that young person, relative, non-relative, in church, not in church. Talk to that young person and tell that young person where that strength comes from. I'm talking to 4 people here who've been in this battle 30, 40, 50 years, been in this struggle. Tell that young person that whose struggle is not going to end next month, next week, with a high school, college, or doctorate degree. Tell them where your strength comes from. Who wants to start first? Pete?
I guess it comes from just the belief that this is what you're assigned to do. It's just a belief that you must do all you can do to help change the conditions as you see them. And it doesn't require money. It just requires that you speak the right word or engage in the right activity or be prepared and willing to minister to someone or reach back and try to get someone. My wife laughs. I teach at 2 colleges, and my wife laughs sometimes because she says, when those students email you, you stop what you're doing and respond. And I do that because my professors didn't do that. And so a student has an issue, and they reach out to you as their professor. You have a responsibility to stop what you're doing and respond to that student.
Because
And
you teaching them.
sometimes it's nothing that has anything to do with my course. It has everything to do with them believing that if they ask me a question, I'll give them an honest answer. And so we laugh about that, but that's just who I am. I don't really care. And I tell my students, in order to fail my class, you must work at it.
Very hard.
You must work at it. You got to work very
Because you're
hard.
going to be there.
Because I'm going to be there for them. Now, that's what I do now. I remember I spent some years in government. I remember in the prison system, wanting to convert from in-house food service to a contract food service, which is a process. And we had to do the specs and get the approval and then put the contract out to bid. And lo and behold, they put the contract out to bid, and the contract was awarded to an African-American company. First time it had ever happened in this organization. And the secondary response was a reevaluation of the vendor and my relationship to ensure that I wasn't trying to steer the contract to the African-American company. And the thought that I had when I responded was that that's what happens. Doesn't that happen when a white company wins? Who says that you have to reevaluate to see if there was any influence by the administrator to ensure that it was a fair contract? Went out to bid, they won, and I was incensed by that we award contracts every day to non-African American companies, and no issue was ever raised. But because
Whole system.
now I'm in the position of executing this contract, we have to make extra sure that there was no undue influence, and so that meant that in my mind, I had to make sure that company was successful. Now, somebody else would have run from that company and ducked from that. I wanted to make sure that company was successful because you'd never asked that question of any other vendor that came in here. I don't know where it came from, but I was annoyed. I was annoyed.
You were annoyed.
Yeah, I was annoyed that you would raise that issue. You have to stand in the gap of right. You just don't have any choice, and it comes. I don't know where it comes from. I think it's just where we position ourselves.
I think God has so taught us, nurtured us, and filled us that we are sometimes an enigma to ourselves. We're a mystery to ourselves. I don't think any of you probably thought in the romping years of your plans of who you'd be and what you do that your life would take the path it took. But I think each of you would conclude that it was the Lord's doing.
Absolutely.
It was the Lord's doing. And what's interesting about that is people would think that people of faith, don't have great lives. Would all of you say you have a good life that you enjoy? In the midst of doing his will, he is making your life good. It's a strange reality, but as we serve him, he knows what we need in our lives. And he feeds us what we need to be whole, that we might feed the world with what he wants to have. The world may not change watching what we are doing tonight, but prayerfully, somebody is saying, there's some folk who are committed, who I didn't know. but I can walk in their footsteps. I can be like them. Ed, when you think about your commitment, Tammy, when you think about yours, Jada, when you think about, do you see in your own self how God has not let you fail at the effort you're trying to do? Eddie, you want to, then we're going to wrap up because I know our time is moving past.
No, and like Pete said, sometimes it seemed like I was working at it, but I don't think it just seemed like sometimes God just said, "Not this is not it. This is not the hill you're going to die on. This was a bad. It was not the fight you needed to choose even necessarily, but this is not the hill you're going to die on." And I think it is because of that. 'Cause the question you asked before this one about what will we tell,
Yeah.
you know, young people. I think about my own three bigs and a little, and I think if you let someone else tell you how to value yourself, you can't do this, right? You can't, because there will be the things that not really knowing who you are and being centered and grounded in who you are and who you are in your faith and who you are in God, and allowing then alternative values to sort of tell you who is who and what's good, will make will it will shake you so badly, because what you will start to apply these things to yourself and compare yourself to where you are, where you ought to be, or what it should look like. And I think that really does undermine the strength that you need to stay in the fight. And so it becomes difficult, right? If taking the path means there's some easier money that you didn't make, there's some other influential people that you didn't get to hang around with, there's some positions you took that were not especially popular, and you paid a price for that, because you pay a price for that sometimes, you might decide that price is too great unless your definition of you accounts for that.
Yes.
And I think that one of the things that I have grown in my walk, as we have walked parts of it together, it has been not just understanding, getting to know who I am. There's some parts I don't care for. There's some that get locked up away because they're not fit for, human contact. But I know I know what they all are. And understanding that, starting that love and compassion with who you are, and then understanding the power that works through that, even with the flaws, and then saying, so therefore I can be in this fight and still tap into that, notwithstanding the places where I know I'm weak, because that definition is solidified. I think that's the thing. That's, if I have something to leave those four with, that is, I've been trying to tell you not who you are, but to tell you to learn, understand, appreciate, love, and thank God for who you are.
That line, and thank God
Thank God.
for who you are, so that you don't get self-hate and in turn hate others. But thank God for who you, and to know that who you are is fearfully and wonderfully made. Tammy?
I would only add to always keep in mind that God can do anything. It does not matter how it looks. As you said, it does not matter what your plans may be. Life has many, many detours. But as long as there is a knowing and a belief that you will get to where you need to be, and you are willing to put in the work. So none of it's easy. We're sitting up here talking about it like it happened overnight. When I graduated from undergrad, I was a mom. And, in some worlds, that's the beginning of the end. You don't become a lawyer as a single mother, but it can happen. You can go to public schools and still be general counsel and an attorney and a minister. It does not matter where you start. It matters where you want to go and who you want to be and the work that you are willing to put into it, never, ever losing yourself, knowing that God has requirements and obligations. You can't be out here doing certain things, as you said. You can't engage in certain conducts. You have to always stay on the road that will take you to a place where you will remain proud of who you are and God will be pleased with you.
Yes.
And if you're doing that, it all will come together. It might take 10 years, 15 years, or 5, but it will come together. You just have to trust and believe and walk.
I like something both of you alluded to. There's a cost to being you.
Oh my.
You know what you and those of us who make the commitment to say, God, I'm going to be involved in the purposes you lay in front of me. We do pay a cost. There's certain things we're not invited to, certain things we don't do, certain places we don't get to go, certain jobs we don't get, certain monies we don't get. But that's a cost we're willing to pay because what we are getting from what we are living is more than enough to put that smile on our face and that victory in our lives because we do have successes. We may not be president. You know, when you mentioned Barack Obama we're not going to be president. Ain't nobody going to elect me. I can promise you that. But we have our successes that we can look at and say, God, this is what you've done. And that's a message I think every young person. JD, you want to give us our last word?
I just want to say to young people, God sees you. God sees you trying to pay these debts off. God sees you with your student loan debt. God sees you trying to own a house and the struggle to get good credit, right? To get credit that's affordable. God sees you trying to pay your bills, trying to buy food and pay for the gas. And God, because God has always seen me, Bishop, and there's been that invisible hand that has been over my life through the pain, the trauma, the hurt, the bad decisions. I remember times saying, because I could see a light, God is up to something in my life. This is not even about me. Like the fact that I got into this school or I got in, I was able to go to seminary or whatever. I'm like, God is up to something in me. He is working out something for his purposes and he's using me. And God is a purposeful God. And so there's purpose in this. Like whatever you are struggling with from a justice or inequity standpoint, God has purpose for you to be the change, even driven by the thing that you are most grieved by. And so hang in there, stay in the fight. We have your back. The Holy Spirit and the angel armies of God will fight with and for you. Just do not give up because God knows what you're going through.
Let me say to each and every one of you who've been sharing with us today, you see how freely the conversation just flows. Justice is not a topic you can't talk about. It's not one you have to fear talking about or be afraid who you're going to anger. The Bible says speak the truth in love. In coaching, we teach people to ask questions for which you don't know answers. Just start the conversation with folk, talking about their strength and what strength they need in the struggles that we're facing in life, the struggles they're facing. Ask questions like, how can we support you? Don't ask people how you can help them. Ask them how you can support them. How can I support you in what you're trying to accomplish? What do you think we need to be doing to make the world better? Because the world can be better. And so many people are waiting on God to send a lightning bolt. That's not what's going to happen. God's going to use us to make the world better. We must rise up, Christians, and follow. We must stand up for Jesus. We must be one army of the living God. Tonight, you got a chance to listen to some of my friends talk about how they participate in this. And we did it from a very lofty level because conversations need to start there, because then you begin to feel the ease with other persons. Don't start in the nitty-gritty. Start at a place talking about yourself, talking about who you are in Christ Jesus and what he's calling you to do. You will find that you will be doing little things to help other folk because the Bible says, do justly. I close with this. We talk about justice. Justice is both a noun, caring for each other, making sure that other persons are treated correctly. but it's also a verb, being committed to make sure that which is wrong ends and that which is right is brought forward. So it is a noun and a verb. Speak it as a noun, live it as a verb. And get ready to share with us the next time we come together to just talk about faith and justice. Have a good evening.